my great pleasure to introduce Professor Floya Anthias. I'll just say a few words to introduce her. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Floya and her work. Floya is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and is an anti-racist and socialist feminist academic whose work has been concerned with different forms of oppression and power relations and their intersection. She's written extensively on issues of race and racism, nationalism and migration, as well as gender and class. Having held professorships at a number of UK universities, she is now Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Social Justice at the University of Roehampton. Floya was born in Cyprus and migrated as a small child, and I've had the pleasure on a previous occasion of hearing Floya speaking about that experience of migrating from Cyprus as a small child with her parents to Britain. Her most recent book is Translocational Belongings, Intersectional Dilemmas and Social Inequalities, which was published by Routledge in 2020. And I would just like to say that it's a great pleasure for me personally that Floya is here today and that she's kicking off our seminar series for this semester. When I was a student, one of the books that I actually went out and bought, and I was a poor student, I didn't have much money, but I did go out and buy the book Racialized Boundaries, Race, Nation, Gender, Colour and Class and the Anti-Racism Struggle, which was a very important book in kind of developing my thinking as a young sociologist, which was published in the early 1990s. I'm giving my age away now, but as a student in the early 1990s. And that was a really genre-defining book, path-breaking book, written by Floya Anthias and Neera Yuval Davis. And together they really did break boundaries and redefine a lot of the key issues that were under debate at that period. So Floya, as well as Neera, were very important in developing my thinking. So it's a great pleasure for me, without further ado, to introduce Professor Floya Anthias. Over to you, Floya.
Well, thank you very much, Louise, for that very charming introduction. And I'm very sorry about the technical hitch, but hopefully I'll stay online now. And basically this talk is around some of the main ideas in the book that you mentioned, my latest book, Translocational Belongings, Intersectional Dilemmas and Social Inequalities, as you mentioned. And I want to first of all locate my book and my argument in two different kinds of debates. And I think that's very important in order to kind of understand the gist of what I'm trying to do in this book. Firstly, I'd like to locate my book in arguments that treat categories of otherness, categories of difference, social categories like gender, race, ethnicity, class, which I think are still probably the most central categories and divisions and inequalities in society. Those arguments that treat these are central to the pursuits of capitalism in the modern world, i.e. they're part of the fabric of capitalist social formations. And with one of the arguments that I make in the book is that without the manipulation and utilization of these categories of difference, capitalism would not be able to survive in its present form. Whether it's absolutely essential to capitalism per se is another issue, which I think, we can't answer. It's a sort of, one of those kinds of $60 billion questions. But certainly in terms of modern capitalism, there is a great deal of reliance on these categories and the way in which they're used, and also the identifications that kind of are manufactured through them, and the othernesses and hostility. Great reliance on these for doing some of what you might call the dirty work of capitalism, which is to do with exploitation and exclusion. And I think, for example, when I say I want to locate it within those arguments, and there's a long history of those arguments stemming, of course, from a Marxist approach, but also more recently, a regeneration of an interest and development in ideas about racial capitalism, where the argument is that capitalism is very racialized and depends very much on racial categories, and also social reproduction feminism, or gendered capitalism, if you like, or sexualized capitalism is another way of putting it, which argue again that kind of constructions of difference around gender and sex and sexuality are central to the workings of capitalism. I want to locate my work in that. And in a way, I sort of do something broader than those arguments about racial capitalism and gendered capitalism. I actually point to how categories of difference as such are very useful tools, and that they come in and out of salience at different times. They shift and change in terms of the projects, particular projects of governmentality relating to capitalist social relations, that is state practices and discourses around governing, and also in terms of exploitation and economic profit for capitalism. So that's one way I would like to locate the book within those arguments. And the central message of the book is how these categories of difference actually work to do some of the dirty work of capitalist social relations. And they take different forms. They're not essentialized, but certainly in neoliberal capitalism, we find they take particular forms. And the second way I'd like to locate my book is in terms of the way in which there's been a great deal of development about what you might call intersectional frameworks. And I'd like to locate my book in those developments. Certainly intersectional, the intersectional approach has been very influential, particularly within feminist work. It's an area of work that I've been working within for a very long time. When I started, particularly in the work that I did with Mira that you just mentioned, it was very much concerned with social divisions and how social divisions interconnected together and needed to be looked at simultaneously, and how they affected each other. But of course, later on, this whole area of work came to be known as intersectionality. This is something that the book can be located, these two parameters, if you like, of arguments, the book can be located within. And in terms of this, this area of work, I develop, and I've been developing for some time, a particular kind of lens for looking at how different forms of inequality, or processes of inequality making rather, interrelate with one another, which I've called a translocational lens. It's often known as a translocational positionality approach. In this book, I actually refer to a translocational intersectionality because I couldn't avoid, if you like, kind of adding intersectionality to it, since intersectionality has become, such a sort of accepted way of thinking about things. Although in my approach, I also have certain reservations about certain types of intersectional approaches. I think I talk about intersectionality as a heuristic, and I frame my approach, translocational lens, within that intersectional heuristic. And I develop what I would call a dialogical and multi-level framework, as well as pointing to various conceptual methodological tools that we can use. So this is how one can think about locating it. And what is then, coming back to the argument about categories of difference, the argument here is that categories of difference I see as places in the order of things. Categorizations and associated forms of belonging, I argue, involve the marking and making of places of difference. And those places of difference map out the borders and boundaries of entitlements, of resource allocation, of inclusion and exclusion, and inequality. And these categorical places or formations, they're set out kind of arenas for to be filled by collectivized subjects, by human bodies who are deemed to possess the appropriate attributes or identifications to fill the places. Now, the attributes and identifications of the bodies can shift and change. They can shift and change as properties are conferred upon them by various forms of governance and various shifting politics and political and economic projects. So categories of difference set out places which are then filled with particular marked bodies. Bodies are branded and they're put into places, and this is a very important role to play also in the way people experience their lives and their own forms of identification, belonging, and of course forms of resistance, because categories of difference are not just places in the order of things which construct inequality and exclusion and enable their filling with different bodies at different times, but they're also ways in which we resist and struggle against inequalities. So taking up positions within places, taking up a subjectivity around a racialized subject or a particular gendered subject or a class subject, these become modes of political struggle as well. And this is one of the ambivalences or contradictions, if you like, about the use of categories of difference. Not only are they ways of exploiting people, but they also enter into the way we struggle against exploitation and exclusion. I want to say something about that perhaps towards the end, where I look at sort of the dilemmas around a politics of sort of identity politics, if you like, and the binary view that, you know, identity politics and solidarity politics are, you know, are counter to each other, contradictory to each other. And I take a rather different position about identity politics, which is partly based on the acknowledgement that categories of difference can also be modes of resistance and struggle against inequality. So categories of difference then constitute, if you like, ways of placing populations for the purposes of management and control and exploitation. And they're encountered and acted upon through a range of ways. They're not arbitrary. The people who fill these spaces, these places of containment, of inferiorization, of othering, it's not an arbitrary placing of populations, but it takes place in a historical process and through the workings of discursive, organisational and other processes. And these people, they place populations encountered and acted upon, for example, through colonialism, through the colonial encounter, which is one of the arguments, of course, that is made in, you know, racial capitalism approaches, or gendered capitalism, sorry, racial capitalism, through the appropriation, exploitation of labour, through class, ideas about class, through the imperative of the national border, through nationalism, the growth of nationalism, and the coalescence between nationalism and capitalism in the modern era. And of course, through technologies of social reproduction and the reproduction of labour itself, found, for example, in the family form. So here, ideas about gendered capitalism, which I mentioned earlier, come in. So the placing of the populations within the places of ordering, the places of containment, the places of difference, if you like, is not an arbitrary but historical construction, but that history doesn't just go on and on and on repeating itself, but it's transformed and changed through processes in kind of specific societies in specific ways, in very located ways, and very historicized ways. So both the places and the bodies that inhabit them are permeated with forms of valuation. So it's not just about boundary making, the places as boundary making, as differentiating arenas of life, differentiating people, populations, but they're also embedded in moral, evaluative, normative systems of thought. So those bodies become valued in particular ways as the places are valued, and the relationship between the valuation of the places, for example, the valuation of gender and the valuation of those people who fill the category, is dialogically constructed. So, for example, the place of a woman employee itself is constructed through relations which are to do with whether gendered bodies have historically inhabited a particular job. So, for example, we know that as more and more women have entered into teaching and more women have entered into clerical work, which traditionally was a male domain in the 19th century, as more kinds of bodies fill certain kinds of occupations, and the place of the occupation, where it stands in the hierarchical system, will also transform and change. So there is a dialogical relationship between the valuation of the places and the valuation of the bodies. So it's not just the places that give certain value to the bodies, but as the bodies enter the places themselves also become imbued with certain valuation as well, and often act as a legitimizer of unequal access and distribution, so that once individuals and their bodies, properties, psyches and action are placed into categories, they endow individuals with attributions, with possessive properties, which are seen to have necessary social effect through naturalizing them. So that here we have an argument that one of the ways in which categories of difference we know historically have worked is through the justification of the inequality by allocating a different value to the persons involved in the category. So, for example, racialized labor, one of the justifications that migrants, for example, who are racialized, earn less than the average, is that those migrants, their desert, their capacity to work, their skills, their commitment, or all sorts of arguments might be used here, is less than others, and therefore we can justify paying them less. And we can see this very carefully, very centrally in the way in which women's work has been treated, and justifications about women not earning the same as men, not having the same opportunities, occupation as men, has often revolved around the valuation of women as workers, that their interests are elsewhere, that they're more committed to their children, and therefore they don't deserve giving them higher income, even though there is, of course, many kinds of attempts to, we can think cynically, are made by the state to treat women and racialized people in a more equal way through equal opportunities policies in the 90s and through various other mechanisms. Nonetheless, it still persists today. So this branding of individuals that takes place is an important exercise in the marking out the spaces of their social engagement and their differentiated inclusion and exclusion. And it's also implicated in a group making process. Groups are constructed in this way. They're either attributed, people are attributed to membership to certain groups, they're defined as members of groups, and they themselves might make claims to belonging to certain groups. I might make a claim, for example, to being British. Sometimes that claim that I make to being British may on the ground be disputed, particularly if I'm Black or if I'm a migrant. But nonetheless, there are attributions and claims relating to group making processes. So collectivized subjects are often constructed as groups. And when groups are constructed, often it's through some process of a naturalization of the group being given certain necessary essences, some necessary characteristics, that they're, you know, more likely to be entrepreneurial, that they're more likely to be criminals, they're more likely, if they're women, to be sort of more dexterous, or kind of more interested in mothering than in being career women, and so on. So this is where, you know, what I said earlier, categories and indeed group making being not only modes of differentiating people, branding people, ways in which resources become allocated and entitlements become allocated to people, but they're also forms of positionality, identification, belonging, if you like, and forms of resistance as well. So the book, as well as making this sort of central argument, is organised around various contemporary dilemmas of difference and inequality, and it's structured around various dilemmas which show some of the ambivalences and contradictions in the manifestations, for example, of racism and racialisation processes, and gender and sex and sexuality. And class. And one of the main things about the book that I'd like to highlight is that it's sort of enters, I said before, it entered this debate about how categories of difference serve capitalist social relations, and that it's linked also to intersectional frameworks, but it's also, you know, an attempt to think about social stratification, about social inequalities, stratification moving away from very traditional models of stratification that generally make the distinction between class and status, and where social stratification then is about bringing together class and status categories, often within traditional social stratification theory. Gender, ethnicity and race, for example, are treated as status group or status elements, as something to do with, you know, just how people are valued, or how people experience life, or what kinds of deference people have towards people. They're treated as sort of, in a way, subsidiary or second to economic processes. Whereas in the approach that I try to argue for, I treat gender, ethnicity, race, and any other salient categories of difference that emerge at particular times as themselves imbued by the material, by the economic. Indeed, one of the main arguments is class also cannot be treated as merely an economic category, as of course some sociologists have increasingly recognized, but class, gender, race, ethnicity, just to stick to those for now, are part of a kind of cultural material nexus in social life, and they all have economic features as well as cultural features attached to them. And it's not just that gender and race, ethnicity enter later on into class, but rather that class itself was already imbricated with gender and race characteristics right from the outset. And one of the things that, even though if you like, some of my approach can be linked to a Marxist approach, which is where I suppose I originally kind of came from. Nonetheless, I think one of the problems with Marx and Marxism is that it doesn't have a theory of difference attached to it. And there is no way in which we can understand why particular populations, particular marked bodies enter the economy, enter the production process and the relations of production process in particular ways. Why is there such a consistent kind of a place for Black people, racialized people, for women? There's no way in Marxism that we can really understand why capitalism would have these areas where particular kinds of bodies are marked and particular bodies enter in, although there have been some attempts to look at this, of course, through classical work on race by people like Cedric Robinson and Oliver Cox, and more recently by Satnam Virdi and various other people. So in terms of, so social stratification then gets rethought away from the traditional approach, which distinguishes between class and status, towards looking at how, you know, the interrelationships between these categories of difference, which signals, if you like, the intersectional aspect of the work that I'm doing, come to produce certain configurations of inequality and certain experiences for people. So that's, you know, the main approach of the book. And I just want to say briefly something about the limitations in some of the work of people like, well, important thinkers, social theorists like Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. Although I have a chapter where I look at various contributions about theorising categories of difference. And I just want to be very brief here. And in relation to Foucault, and of course his very important kind of contribution in terms of biopolitics and governmentality, I think one of the difficulties, but it seems to me, well, argue in the book, there are two difficulties. One is that he makes too great a distinction between governmentality, a kind of the biopolitics, which is formed through discursive processes, and violence and state violence. And I think that, you know, governmentality of populations cannot be separated from the means of violence that the state exercises and the means of other means of control. And I think we can too readily read into governmentality consensus and compliance, that it's one way in which people become compliant. And I think there are various historical instances where we can see that what appears sometimes as compliance by exploited populations will quickly become resistance once there is an opening for resistance. I'm thinking, for example, of the important work, for example, of Eugene Genovese in Red and Black, where he shows how black slaves in America who were deemed to be kind of the Uncle Tom kind of people, who were the most compliant, the most differential as slaves, were the first group, according to Genovese, to take to arms to revolt against slavery. So that's a kind of example of reading too much into governmentality without paying attention to the forms of violence that back it up, that bolster it. And I think Nancy Fraser has also critiqued Foucault along similar, although not identical. The other thing, the second thing about Foucault is that he's more interested in kind of how populations are governed, governmentalities over populations as a whole, rather than how specific forms of the population are created, specific categories, although he does have a category of the abnormal that he looks at, but he sees the rise of the abnormal categories of the population as a product of the rise of the psychiatric subject. And I don't think it's easy to think of categories of difference like racial, particularly those that suffer violence and racialization, as, you know, constructed through notions just of the abnormal, because a lot of racialization and sex and gendering and sexism aren't constructed just through thinking of these categories as abnormal, as deviant, but they can be constructed in a number of ways. For example, just being outside the boundaries of the self or the collective self through nationalism and nativism, for example, in the case of race, or in the case of gender, they can be hailed as exotic subjects, not just not abnormal, but rather they can be even put on a pedestal for some purposes, but at the same time treating them as inferior and subordinated. So, you know, engaging with some of this work of Foucault is interesting, because he also has he talks about counter conduct where people can resist, but I think that this is very underdeveloped in his work. And I would say that the ideas about agency and resistance are kind of largely missing from his overall perspective. In his later work, he tried to do a little bit more with this, but not at the whole. And Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, who's very well known, particularly in the area of social class and stratification. Here, I think one of the difficulties is the way he constructs the notion of the habitus, and the notion of the habitus in Bourdieu signals the predispositions and inclinations of people that become kind of normalized or natural for them through their location in particular places within fields like education or the economy, or education. Sorry, I probably mentioned education already. Anyway, through fields, but particularly linked to their social place within fields, or the social class position. Class habitus is one of the main ideas that he produces. When I remember when I was an undergraduate being very, very excited by this notion of the habitus, and also by notions of cultural and social capital. But looking at some of this work, which was, of course, very foundational and path-breaking, we can again see a sort of rather deterministic notion of the habitus, a habitus which emerges out of social location, a habitus in a way which is over-determining, which is homogeneous. And I think by turning to a more intersectional approach, which looks at the placement of individuals within a range of different places of difference, and constructing themselves also in terms of positionalities around those places of difference, and how they sometimes kind of contradict one another, they relate to one another in many, many different ways. I don't think we can have one way of thinking about how these different categories intersect, if you like, around race, gender, ethnicity, for example, but they might intersect in many different ways, sometimes producing contradictory positions, as well as reinforcing inequality. I think that opens up the space for thinking about a kind of habitus that is non-homogeneous, that is already imbued with conflict and contradiction, therefore taking away the deterministic and rather fatalistic approach that the habitus seems to be embedded in. So that's one of my kind of, if you like, my ideas about how a kind of more intersectional framework can correct some of the more monolithic and fatalistic approaches, which relates also to the political, to politics. So I think that now what I want to do, I mean, I'm not going to talk about you know, the specific arguments in, I mean, I have one chapter on dilemmas of gender, and another on dilemmas of class, and another on dilemmas of race and racialisation, look at migration. What I want to do with the time that's left, I don't know how long I've got actually, and also my iPad is actually going to, the battery is going to go in a minute. So
oh dear. You've got a few more minutes, Floria, but do you want
how long have I got?
Do you want to reconnect your laptop?
Well, I tell you what, I'm going to go and ask my partner to get my battery, my thing. Just 1 minute.
Yeah, so while Floria is just sorting out the battery charger for her laptop, just to explain, as soon as Floria has finished speaking, I will be inviting people to please type their questions in the chat, or if you'd rather not type your questions in the chat, you can put your hand up, and then we'll invite you to turn your microphone on and ask your question. In the meantime, I see that our colleague Anna, who's doing a great work there in the background, has just posted in the chat the information about Floria's book, and that there's a 30% discount. So if anybody is interested in buying the book, please note that this 30% discount is valid until the 8th of October. So you've got 2 days to hurry up and order your copy of the book. So that information is currently in the chat. Are you okay there, Floria? Have you managed to find the charger?
I've got to have to hold it in a different way because the charger is at the bottom and I can't prop it up. Anyway, if you sort of stop seeing me, it's not that I've disappeared, but I've gone under the radar in a different way. So I'm back there now with the battery charger. So sorry, Louise, do you want to continue or?
No, I was just drawing people's attention to the information about your book in the chat. So I've done that now. So back over to you again. Okay.
And how long have I got?
You've got about another 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes if you wish.
Okay, because I was going to, but maybe it's not necessary. I was going to actually home in or about 3 other aspects, which is giving a little bit more detail. Well, firstly, very, very briefly, I'll do that. The first point is that boundaries of difference, I argue, are porous, given the potentially contradictory placing of people within and across them. They're porous, i.e. they're never completely effective, these boundaries. These boundaries are open to contestation and struggle, and there's always struggle and contestation around the boundaries. So we can't see them ever as fixed completely. So that's the first point. Secondly, I want to say something about the notion of translocation. So the way I use the term, so that what is a translocational lens, which is what I'm trying to develop to intersectionality, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And thirdly, I want to actually look at the implications for politics, for a notion of the politics, if you like, of translocation. So I won't say anything more about the porosity of the boundaries. You can get much more if you do manage to get hold of the book, or you want to buy it or get it in your library. But I just want to say something about translocation because, my work is often identified with this approach of kind of translocational lens or translocational positionality. And here what I'm trying to do is link the idea of the locations, or if you like, the places of the categories of difference, like gender, race, class, disability, and so on, so well, not the etc. of Judith Butler, but rather the salient ones that emerge at particular points in time. I want to look at those locations as basically hierarchical locations. They're part of a system of hierarchy. And these are intertwined with locations or locales in a different sense, which are locales relating to the physical and symbolic locations within which they operate. So the notion of translocation is both a referent to how the locations of gender, race, and class as hierarchical locations are embedded in one another in concrete social relations, and how those concrete social relations, the intersubjectivities, the structures, the discourses, the representations, the experiential level, how all these link to particular locales, which are themselves imbued with hierarchy relating to the state, the economy, the law, which themselves also intersect with one another. So it's a reference to, it's a way of not kind of making a nod towards also the transformationary and the historicization over time of the locations and the locales. Because one of the kind of, okay, the names don't matter so much as long as we can understand what an approach is trying to say. But for example, one of the criticisms that has often been made about intersection is that it's about it's about the relation of one thing to another, which is a little bit possibly static, what it gives over as a phrase, and the section might constitute a way of thinking about gender, race, and class as sections, as given attributions or given identities, and so on. Translocation, in a way, is kind of referencing a much more kind of, if you like, attempting at least a much more nuanced approach that focuses on processes and on outcomes rather than on individuals and their identities, and looking at them in a, as a transformational. But I haven't got time really to go into that now, because I do actually say quite a lot about it in the book, about what the notion of trans indicates, or what I'm trying to do with it. And now just finally, the political. And right at the beginning, I talked about categories of difference not only being hierarchy making and forms of control, but also as ways in which we can resist. We can take up categories. We can transform the meaning of the categories. We can embrace them in a different way, as for example, the queer category has been embraced by the LGBTQ community as something which organizes one's struggle in a solidary way. And similarly with Black, the way in which being Black has been during, particularly in America, how Black became, through Black power, something different to the way it was being treated as a category of inferiorization. So we can use these categories, if you like, we can construct these identities in different ways to which socially they've been constructed as forms of resistance, which to me then opens up the way of thinking about an identity politics, which isn't just about strategic essentialism, to quote Gayatri Spivak, which is that we take on these identities just for kind of, if you like, pragmatic or strategic purposes, but that identity politics can be an actual useful way of organizing ourselves, because they're built on similar experiences often, and we can use a particular nomenclature, a particular ethnicity, for example, to struggle, as long as that is not exclusionary, and as long as the struggle isn't just about those who occupy that identity at a particular point in time. I can give you an example from my own country, from Cyprus, where we can organize as Cypriot women in a global world, i.e. we take the identity of Cypriot women, but we're globally linked to other women's groups. We can even go one step down and take on the identity of Greek Cypriot women and Turkish Cypriot women, as long as we are with each other for the purposes of solidarity. But we might have specific struggles of our own to make within our own communities, given the different placement, the different religions, the different ideas about gender that exist within Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot communities. Possibly, that's just an example. The idea of, where Dalit women might be organizing as Dalit women, but that's okay to organize as long as the struggle is not just about Dalit women, it extends beyond, or as migrant women we organise, again, as long as it's not just about. So that kind of identity politics, I would distinguish from an identity politics that is purely concerned with improving the position or struggling for the constituency within which with which one organises. One can organise with a constituency without organising just for a constituency. If you can see what I mean. So here, what I wanted to say is that I know that the right-wing press have taken over this idea, oh, identity politics is bad, you know, let's rubbish it, and so on, you know, or they say this is just about identity politics. This is on the right. On the left, we might find something rather different. So, well, identity politics takes us away from class. So let's again rubbish identity politics because it's all about class. And I want to say that identity politics as a mode of organisation often can be very effective in bringing people together in solitary communities away from that identity. So the identity politics is not, I don't juxtapose it to solidarity politics, but I argue it can be, for certain purposes, a form of solidarity politics itself. And again, in the book, in my last chapter, I explore this in a little bit more detail. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope I haven't gone over time too much. Okay,
Thank you very much, Floria. That was so thought-provoking and stimulating, and so much there for us to really sink our teeth into and think about. And as I was listening to you, particularly at the beginning when you were talking about capitalism and the dirty work of capitalism, I was thinking, well, you couldn't have a more salient example at the moment than that of haulage drivers and the long distance lorry drivers, and the ways in which the government is now saying, oh, for too long the haulage industry has relied on low paid migrants, mainly Eastern European migrants, and somehow there's a narrative in there that it's the migrants' fault, that the migrants have driven the wages down to such an extent that no British worker would have any interest in driving a lorry. So there's again that sort of narrative of not just the valuation of the poor migrant as not worthy of a decent wage, but in fact blaming the migrant for driving down the wages in the first place. So I was thinking about that as I was listening to your talk. But there are so many questions in the chat, Floria, so I'm going to try and backtrack through the chat so that I'm fair to people who put their questions in earlier. So the first question that I see there is from Sean, which is about the evaluation of places and bodies and the marks out of spaces. So Sean, I don't know if you want to turn your microphone on and ask your question to Floria, or was that just a comment? Sean also promised me a cup of coffee, which I'm still waiting on. Sean, do you want to turn your microphone
on? Yes, I've turned. Is it on?
Yes, we can hear you now, Sean. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Don't worry, I'll send that cup of coffee real quick.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to, of course, thank you very much, Prof. Floya, for such a very powerful and insightful presentation. There's quite a number of questions that I wanted to ask because your presentation just sparked a lot of thought in me. But I'll restrict myself to just one. One of the things that you mentioned is on the marking out of spaces for social engagement. I think for me, there was a very critical point in terms of how space, in the way in which it is marked out, can actually sort of like dictate how we interact with each other in our categories of difference and things like that. So I just wanted to know how do we combat such a thing as the marking out of spaces? Because if you mark out spaces and give certain spaces to these categories of people and then exclude these categories of people, it's something that is quite difficult to sort of like confront and combat. So I just wanted to know how do we deal with such a problem? And thank you very much once again.
Well, thank you very much for your question, and it's you know, a very big question, of course, because it raises the whole issue of political struggle, doesn't it? You know, how do we counteract the places that we're given, the boundaries around us, and who we are, where we belong, what our entitlements are? How do we challenge these? And one of my arguments is that we need that's challenging them is something that is happening continuously. That I think people who are disenfranchised, people who are allocated in inferior positions, I think are very much in the process always of challenging, because one of the elements that I pay attention to is that intersectional places, because these spaces of containment are spaces that intersect with one another. So the spaces of containment, for example, as a woman, might be different to the spaces of containment as a migrant, or someone who's racialized, or a member of the working class. And in the interstices, in the in-between, in the hiatuses of these different spaces, we find challenges, and we can take over, we can become more open to understanding the distinctions that are being drawn and the inferiorizations that are taking place. And I think this is where the intersectional approach can actually give a much more positive, I know we don't feel very positive at the moment, it's pretty bleak out there, but give potentially a more positive approach to resistance than some of the kind of rather fatalistic arguments that, for example, I talked about Foucault and about Bourdieu, that are found there. Because what it draws attention to is, for example, if we think of Crenshaw's notion of the basement, in her work, I don't know whether most of you may have heard about the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, a very important American socio-legal theorist, very known often as the mother of intersectionality, but nonetheless, you know, a scholar that's developed this idea about, you know, some people being at the basement, and if you're in the basement, at the bottom, if you like, of one of these categories, but you might be in the middle of another one, or at the top of another one, from the top of one, you might be able to see through the bottom, being at the bottom of something else. Let's say you're a woman, you're right at the bottom of the gender hierarchy, say, you know, and then you might be a white, you know, rich woman, so that you're placed, you know, in race and class in different ways. I think perhaps as a woman, and some people have argued that women do have the potential of a consciousness that is more aware of, you know, the way in which discriminations work, although it's very often not expressed politically, I know, and I don't want to be essentialist here, but I think the main argument is that if you're placed in a contradictory position overall, that you're in some places, through some categories, through some social locations, even actual locales, you have a privilege, and in others you don't have a privilege. That does alert you, I think, much more to the forms of privilege. And here, I think, you know, these kind of, that's why contradictory locations in that sense, to me, open up spaces of resistance and struggle as well. So I think that resistance against both, in many different ways, resistance not only to forms of governance, to particular kinds of laws, which are very important today, of course, with what's seen, you know, the honing back of human rights and social rights, but also through kind of struggle, resisting categories, resisting naturalizations, being aware of how those categories of different types might come together in a conflictual way as well as in a reinforcing way, and being open to solidary forms of politics that acknowledge that. I think that's a very abstract answer, because, you know, in a way, your question, I would have liked to be able to answer it more concretely in terms of what can we do now politically, but I'm afraid I don't have the capacity to do that. It's at the moment.
Well, thanks for that very detailed answer, Floria. We've got lots of other questions. So the next question I see in the chat is from Digby Warren. Digby, would you like to turn on your microphone and ask your question, which is about capitalism?
Yes, thank you so much, Louise, and thank you, Floria, for such a you know, eye-opening, fascinating analysis. And my question was that, you know, you are talking all the time about to capitalism, but sometimes it sounds slightly abstract to me. I'm an ex-historian, just to sort of give my disciplinary location, now an educationist. But I always try to make sense, what does it actually mean in concrete reality? In my own previous research, I studied the history of Cape politics in the mid-19th century, and I actually undertook a kind of class analysis of who was able to take control of the colonial institutions and shape things in certain ways. But that study showed me it was very difficult to identify what we mean by capitalist, because there were very shifting patterns of behavior among different groups. So I was just trying to work out, this idea that people are put in a place is very powerful idea, but who does the putting and how does the putting happen? And what's, as you've been hinting at, what room is there to resist some of that being put into the place?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a really important question, actually. Whether I'm going to answer it in a satisfactory way for you, I don't know, but I think that I want to address it in two ways. One is that the argument to some extent engages with a kind of more abstract model of capitalism, or of the mode of production, the Marxist analysis of the modes of production, which is at the abstract level. And at that abstract level, Marx talks about processes within capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, that lead to working class revolution, right, to the rise of the proletariat. And there, the significant things in the abstract, or processes in the abstract that he talks about, are some of the contradictions and crises of capitalism that have to do with falling rate of profit, with the use of the reserve army of labour, attempt to use the reserve army of labour in order to counteract the falling rate of profit, increasing polarisation, and so on. And at that abstract level, what is missing, I think, in that abstract level, is the way in which capitalism produces particular figurations of people as well. Now, as at a very abstract level, but these figurations of people as different kinds of bodies with different needs and capacities is perhaps something that we found through history. And as a historian, I mean, I bow to you. You know much more about this than I do, but I'm not suggesting that categorizations just emerged functionally out of capitalism. Categorizations are historicized, they're part of a historical process. But what at the abstract level, at the analytical level, if you like, of the mode of production, there could have been a place for Marx to develop an analysis of categories of difference, of the way in which that also is part and parcel of the way in which capitalism as a mode of production tries to deal with its crises by changing, fixing people, by unfixing them, by becoming making people more fluid, opening up borders and boundaries and then closing them in different ways. So at the abstract level, one could see that there might have been a place for, sort of for a Marxism that recognized how the whole idea of population categories, not just the population, but the construction of different categories of the population, might be a tool for the dealing of crises within capitalism. That's at the abstract level, right? Now, at the more concrete level, when we're talking about social formations, we're not talking about capitalism just as a mode, but talking about societies that we call capitalism. Of course, these societies are very different to the societies or the society that Marx was talking about when he developed his model, and through his historical writings, of course. It's a capitalism that has had to make concessions, has been, the contestations and organizations of the contestations have led to very different kinds of capitalisms today. real capitalism than they had in the past. And capitalism, you know, the emergence of the welfare state, the emergence of equal opportunities policies, of anti-racist policies, of, you know, the concessions on the ground that are being given, fought for by constituencies on the ground, have produced a very different kind of capitalism. But I would argue, as capitalism has made concessions over time, its economic project, which I see primarily as an inequality project, as a project that is concerned not just with the maintenance of profit by a capitalist class, although that's one aspect of it, but it's a project that's dedicated to perpetuating, reproducing, rebranding continuously inequality on the ground and allocating people to those places of inequality making on the ground. So I think capitalism today is characterized by being an inequality making machine on the whole. And capitalists, this reification in Marxism of profit, which you saw, of course, as one of the motors of capitalism at the level of the mode of production. Once we move to real social formations, I think we can fetishize the economic in the sense of the extraction of profit too much, because one of the arguments that I make is that the way in which the economic and the cultural are symbiotically connected, as other way of thinking about it is the material and the symbolic, that in order for profit, for a capitalist class to be something desirable, not only does it have to allow them to make more money, to make profit, and therefore to increase their capital and be able to remain as capitalists, but it also has to service their other needs for status, for honor, for sex, or whatever, you know, that it has to give them symbolic value. And this is where I think Bourdieu was absolutely right, that actually all forms of value at the end of the day gain their value through symbolic value. That, you know, money, you know, will only be something that's valuable to you if it has some symbolic value, because after a certain point, however much money you've got in the bank, you know, what can you do with it to make you, you know, sort of to serve your needs? You know, you can buy so many houses, you can buy, you know, so many yachts and so on, but what else can it do? So it's achieved, what the argument here is that it takes on symbolic value. And this is where I think that modern capitalism, and today we have what some call neoliberal forms of modern capitalism, one of the things, you know, one of the engines of this capitalism, in fact, is the increasing churning out of different valuations, different desirabilities, different symbolic, you know, in the past we talked about consumer society, now we have the celebrity culture, we have, you know, this, you know, different modes of that. So I don't know whether that, you know, is too abstract.
I mean, I was just listening when you were speaking about that, and it now seems that the marker of ultimate wealth is to launch a rocket into space, and we've now got 3 billionaire men competing with each other to launch the fastest, biggest rocket into space, which is literally pushing the boundaries of symbolic value, symbolic power and status beyond planet Earth into the stratosphere. And, you know, for me, I cannot miss an opportunity to talk about the climate emergency, because I'm kind of obsessed about the climate emergency. And I think we risk losing sight of the big avalanche that's coming down the road to all of us. Not least, you know, the flooding that we saw in London yesterday. The climate emergency is here. And what we see, of course, with capitalism is how that is very much at odds with all of the values that you've been talking about, the kind of conspicuous consumption, the kind of accumulation of profit at all costs, and how that is coming up against an indisputable challenge, which is that of climate change. So it'll be very interesting to see how some capitalists are trying to jump on that and others are trying to ignore it and dispute it. So we're seeing capitalism now kind of almost confronting the biggest challenge that it has ever been confronted with.
Yes,
and it'll be
absolutely.
very interesting. All of our lives depend on how they agree to proceed. But I can't get on my hobby horse too much. I see somebody's just put some rockets in the chat, which is very nice. Thanks, Tom. There are a couple of questions which maybe I can link together because I'm very conscious of time. One is from Alia Khan, which is about organising around identities versus organising around struggles. And that ties in very nicely, I think, with the question from Erica, although Erica says that you may have already answered her question, but that again was about solidarity and identity politics. So maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more, but perhaps briefly, because there are still a few more questions in the chat, Floria.
Okay. To be very brief, I mean, I have always argued in my work for the importance of struggles, not around identity, but around, you know, specific kinds of struggles, which, you know, apply to everybody, and have been, you know, probably against identity politics in the form of, you know, people just organising on the basis of their, you know, sort of being just women or just black people, just if it's, but on the other hand, I can see very much that this is very necessary in a society where these groups, if you like, you want to use the term groups, are highly disadvantaged, and if they don't speak for themselves, nobody else. Who else spoke for feminism but women? Who else spoke for anti-racism apart from racialized people? Or they took the lead. So it's very important to recognize that organizing on the basis of identity isn't necessarily you know, something undesirable. It only becomes undesirable when it takes on a life of its own and becomes then a claim that only applies to the people who belong to that identity. So, for example, it only becomes a problem when women talk about equality, let's say equality, when they're excluding, let's say white women talk about equality, they're excluding black women, or they, you know, they're engaging with struggles which are just the struggles of white women, particular things. And a lot of the criticism from black feminism, quite rightly, has been about how the priorities of third wave feminism have ignored, you know, the situation, the experiences and life conditions of black women. So that becomes a problem, and that kind of identity politics, I think, is a problem. But an identity politics forged in collaboration with others who share the same or similar kinds of positions of discrimination or inferiorization or inequality, I think, you know, is not only something inevitable in a way that we organise with those that we know best and whose experiences we share, but indeed something desirable because we can draw upon our narratives and we can apply them perhaps to other groups who might share some of those. So as a Greek Cypriot woman, I might be able to draw on the narratives and the myths and the ideas and the experiences that I share with other Greek Cypriot women, but also then be able to not only juxtapose them with those of, say, Turkish Cypriot women, but also share with them ways in which we can deal with similar kinds of things. So that's where I stand with identity politics. I didn't want to, you see, one of the arguments is that I don't want to set them up as binaries, and they're often, this identity politics versus solidarity politics are often set up as binaries, right?
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Floya, but Alia Khan has just commented in the chat that example of Greek Cypriot women was very helpful. Now, I know Anne Phoenix has her hand up, and Amma has asked if she could change her question. So maybe I can go to Anne Phoenix first and then go to Amma and her other question. So in the interest of time, can I go to Anne first and then Amma? Anne, you're very welcome.
Thank you very. Oh.
Hi,
Go
Anne.
ahead, Anne, please go
Can
ahead.
you hear me?
Yes, very
Yes.
clearly.
Oh, okay, thank you, because it says I don't have permission for the microphone and camera. But anyway, thank you. That was really wonderful, Floya. And I wanted to ask again about the issues of identities and intersectionalities. And you've talked very much about how organizing around identities, but not for the identities and not in an exclusionary way, is important. And I wanted to ask about how one thinks about the shifts in different things that one might organize about. In other words, one of the things I'm interested in is shifting alliances and shifting political action. And I just wanted you to say something about that, because in the fluidity that you're talking about, in the translocational issues, how does one manage that move so that it doesn't become a fixed identity, but at the same time, for example, focus on issues that one considers important without ossifying them? I don't know if that's clear, but
When you say shifting, could you say a little bit more what you mean by shifting? Shifting
yes.
alliance?
Yes, I mean, if as you say, that identities can be used for the politics, if they're not to be just fixed and to be identity politics of the sort you wouldn't want, then it has to be the case that it's dynamic enough to shift around to, in other words, it's contingent alliances, contingent political action. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that, because of course people often get fixed in positions in ways that make causes rigid, and that's one of the reasons that they often ossify and fragment in the end. And I wondered if you could say something about that.
Absolutely. And I think that obviously one of the dangers of identity forms of politics is in fact the ossification, where you might, for example, take up a national liberation struggle on the basis of, let's say, again, calling on my own experience as a Cypriot against British colonialists. One could take that up, but then that can become a nationalism. So you then become tied into, nationalist exclusivity, and you start wanting to exclude others as well. And that's always a danger with relying too much on identity. And this is where in intersectional forms of identity are particularly important, because even though one might organize on the basis of, say, being a Cypriot woman, one can then also recognize that one isn't only a Cypriot woman, one is also a woman of a certain age or of a certain class. And that this intersection of one's own experience gives us the ability then to transcend and move away from this idea that, we're all this, we're just this homogenous group of Cypriot women, and we're all the same, and we can ossify our identities. And moving towards an acknowledgement of the differences within ourselves, that identities aren't singular, they never can be, and therefore they can only be contingent, as you say, and they can only be situational in terms of particular kind of struggle that we're engaging in at a particular time, but always being aware of, the, if you like, the excess, that comes from the intersectional. And I mean, I don't have a blueprint, because it's actually a $60 billion question, that how do we stop the ossification of identities? But I think, I mean, one of the things that in my last chapter, I tried to do is talk about a kind of dialogical relationship. The dialogical communicative practice is important, but it's not enough, because kind of the dialogical is always takes place in a space of power and hierarchy, and therefore, I mean, in the last chapter, I try and explore some different parameters for that, to do, with kind of ways of collaborating, sharing power, not speaking for others, for being open, the boundaries being a little bit more open about the constituencies of who can belong to the struggle. And as far as I'm concerned, anyone can belong to a struggle if that's what they feel that they want to struggle against. So that struggling as a member, let's say, of being a Cypriot woman, rather than talking about being a black woman, being a Cypriot woman doesn't mean that other women can't be part of my struggle, can't come along and share with my struggle, and that what I'm saying and struggling for is not also about those other women in those other spaces. So I think that the problem of fixing identities is a real one, and it's part of, I think, the possessive individualism that we have embraced, internalized in capitalist social relationships and social relations. And I think, being always conscious of overcoming the fixing of the boundaries. I know it's a little bit of a weak answer, but I think that, dialogue has been one way, but also that the intersectional itself is a form of the unfixing, I would say. It provides us a mode of unfixing, or it should be able to provide us with a mode of unfixing, because it shows us that we're actually shifting and changing over time, not just over time, but even within ourselves. We inhabit different kind of identifications, and we're attributed different things, and that has different effects at different times. And that already allows us, this translocation, if you like that I put, allows us to be able to recognize that things aren't fixed, and that so on. I don't know whether that helps, Anne, but
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your
question.
Thank you, Anne, and it's very nice to see you as well. Sorry you couldn't turn your camera on. We've got hands going up now. So Amma, to be fair to Amma, you wanted to ask a different question to the one you typed in the chat. So Amma, can I ask you to turn your microphone on now and ask your question?
Sure, thank you very much for everything. It's just a very quick one because I was quite interested in the translocation aspect of it, and I'd never actually heard of that particular term, so I just did a bit of quick background looking, and I saw that it's like quite a lot from biological kind of a biological background or discipline, and I just wondered, did you have any sort of interdisciplinary thinking behind using that term, or had you looked at those kind of perspectives? Just as a quick question.
Thank you very much. Actually, I had no idea when I first introduced the term translocational positionality, I think it was in 2001. I had absolutely no idea about genes and that sort of thing, translocating genes and so on. It's only, subsequently that I was aware that translocation is a particular biological thing that takes place when genes are translocated or something. I don't pretend to understand it. What I thought about it was more in terms of location, moving across locations. So translocations for me was moving across locations. And I first introduced it in 2001, really, as a counter to notions of hybridity. I wrote this article, which in a way was critiquing certain approaches to hybridity, which I thought ossified identities on the one hand and saw them as kind of just coming together, a sort of like added together. And I think that, that's where I got this idea of, instead of why do we talk about hybridity? Why not talk about translocation, about people who move from one location to another, whether it's a location that we all move across locations of gender, say race and class. We're always constantly moving because we're placed differently and we take up those positions differently. And if we also move through other kinds of spaces, we move through locations, but if we're migrants, we might move from one country to another. We move from one neighborhood to another, from one locale to another. We move from symbolic places where we have a certain worth within our families, say, as opposed to a different worth in the classroom or in our work. So we're always translocating, and that's where the term comes from, a kind of a recognition that we're always placed in a space of translocation, if you like. We're never fixed. that, you know, this is where it comes from. It doesn't have anything to do with this sort of biological that you mentioned. But subsequently, I have put the term into Google, and I've come across this translocation, you know, as a biology, but it's nothing, not at all related to that. It's nothing to do. It's not translocation in the sense of moving from one place and being put in another place, which is what I think genetic translocation is. Translocation is about moving between, amongst, if you like, different locales and social places and locations.
Thanks very much, Floya. I'm very conscious of time, and a lot of people are typing in the chat that they have to leave now because it's actually after 5:30. But Maria has her hand up, so maybe we could give the final question to Maria.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah. Sorry, I've got a terrible cold, and I'm sure if we were having this conversation on campus, you would probably ban me from campus. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you, a very big thank you to you, Louise and Maria, for organising this talk, and especially to Anthea. And if I'm allowed to be emotional and personal, a lot of what was discussed today, but also was included in the book, which I read, of course, resonates with my experience as a migrant. And I like to say migrant. I mean, this is my prevalent identity. It has become my prevalent identity in the UK, rather than white or white other or European. And for a number of reasons, I find this identity is very alienating. But anyway, that's another conversation. What I wanted to say is that for many years, I felt very much intellectual homeless or intellectually homeless. So I think, you know, this idea of difference as a place, I mean, for me, it has provided an intellectual repertoire to articulate, but also to theorize my experiences, my lack of entitlements, my exclusions, and various exclusions in different constituencies and spaces. And if I may share a metaphor, I think throughout my life as an academic and a migrant in the UK, I felt very much as a ball, you know, kicked on the football ground, right, left, and center from different constituencies, including, you know, white, non-white, feminist, and non-feminist. And, you know, I struggled for a long time to find also an intellectual repertoire to talk meaningfully about racialized groups, migrant groups in the UK, which are not black, but also not white. Okay, if that makes sense. So I think you know, in terms of solidarity, you know, it's extremely important not to forget, you know, what was discussed earlier. That, you know, we can be, it's fine to be in different constituencies as long as, you know, our agendas do not blind us and we cannot see beyond those. And just to make another point, suffering, I mean, nobody has exclusive rights to suffering. And I find that notion quite helpful because, you know, whenever I go to talks, everybody or presentations or events, people want to talk about their own suffering. And I don't see how, for example, the suffering of, you know, the women in Cyprus can be assigned less value or less pain compared to the suffering of women, I don't know, in a different part of the world, you know, in a marginalized community in Brazil or in Africa, simply, for example, because they're not women of color. So yeah, again, many thanks for your work. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maria, for those.
Thanks, Maria.
Words. Thank you.
Right. So, sorry, Floria, I'm speaking over you.
That's all right.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Maria, and thank you, Floria. There's great comments in the chat. People are very positive about your presentation. There are some questions in the chat that unfortunately we didn't have time to get to, but they are there, and you can see any other queries that people wanted to follow up. People are being really complimentary. Yes, of course.
I just ask you, how do I access the chat after the session has moved, has gone? You see,
that's a very good question. Anna, do you know, is there a way to preserve the chat once we close the session so that Floria can see the comments? There must be a way. Our wonderful Anna colleague is going to copy it and send it to you. Thank you, Anna. That's a good question, Floria, because I didn't actually know the answer to that question, so I'm glad.
You hardly be able to sort of see anything, you know, and I'm sure there are some familiar faces, like, for example, Anne. I can see her name up, but it would be nice to see, you know, who else. I noticed Thomas, but he's left, I think.
Yeah.
Now, Thomas Acton, but yeah.
So it was very, very well attended. At one point, we had 60 people in the room, which is absolutely fantastic. And unfortunately, many of them are leaving now because we've sort of slightly exceeded our time.
Yeah.
But it's a testament to, you know, how engaging and how stimulating your presentation was, that we had so many people and so many people stayed right till the end. So thank you very much, Floya. I'm sorry if you had those technical problems at the beginning, but we overcame them all, and it was a really stimulating presentation. So thank you very much. Of course.
Thank you so much, Louise, as well, for both for your introduction and also for your own contribution, you know, fleshing out, you know, with your own, you know, sort of points, important points, you know, some of the issues. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.